Hi, I'm Kit. I am the Pink Pastor. To some, I wanted to come to you today to talk about my journey from evangelical, Pentecostal, conservative Christian through to today, when I've hit a phase of deconstruction and reconstruction. It's my hope as I put this out into the world that it will give you hope, but also that it will give you strength for the journey. Let you know that if you are moving from one space to another, you're far from alone. There are many of us doing this. You see, because what I know is I look backwards and realize that coming out of high school and the family that I did, the family of origin, which was a lovely family, don't get me wrong. They cared for me and they loved me and they really tried to take care of me. But as is true of many teenagers, I wanted to rebel. And so rebel against somebody who, in this case, was a bit of a hippie and somebody who was definitively a feminist. And the easiest way I could figure out to do this, and really to break away from that to become my own person, was to move into something that was not totally out of keeping with where I grew up, but was certainly not consistent with either. See, I grew up in a church that was radically accepting. We had, again, lesbian community involved in the 70s. We had a female pastor in the 70s. We had single mothers. We had a group of people who were from the differently abled community. We had all sorts of people there. Didn't matter your color or your background or rich or poor. We all came together to do good things in the community. So I grew up in the church, and by that I mean my mom was such a part of the church that, she'd take me with her, and the church became, in many days, my playground. I'd run through the organ pipes, or I'd play in the choir loft, or I'd, just be around the church. And so I had a solid church background, but obviously a church background that was much more liberal than what I'm talking about. But as a teenager and as a young adult, I decided that I wanted to be nothing like those forces. And I don't know how much of that was a conscious decision and how much of that was just me trying to form my own identity, as we all do. I mean, the first step in forming the identity of yourself is to reject the identity that you were given, and I did it with gusto. By the time I was 22, I was married to a young woman who was very much not my mother, and in fact had, at some level, just by getting married that early, broken with the traditions I had been raised with. We had our first child at 22, and whereas I had left the church at 18, not just sort of fallen away, but actually said, no, I don't believe, and left, I came back into the church through the Assemblies of God. And through the prayers and kindness of a dear friend and his wife, the two families grew up together. And we moved at that point from Pennsylvania down to North Carolina. And first I got involved in Baptist churches. One that was labeled the best hellfire and brimstone sermon you'll ever hear. And then from there into the non-denominational evangelical Pentecostal churches. And we became very much involved in church. It was a place for us to have community. It was a place for us to raise our kids and to provide them structure. It was a place that, in fact, in many ways, justified the life that we were living. Very much, fairly early on, I became the chief breadwinner as the man of the family, and my wife got to stay at home with the kids, and we got involved in homeschooling networks for a little bit. And I won't tell you it wasn't a good part in my life. There was a lot of surety involved. There wasn't a lot of questioning involved. There was a lot of learning involved. I mean, but as somebody who is neurodiverse and as somebody who is trans, having totally rejected both of those at that point, probably not even aware that they were true, it provided me a place that made me feel, quote unquote, normal. As long as I was willing to buy into and abide by the roles that were handed to us, the truths that were handed to us, we could be a part of, and we would be considered normal. And in fact, in that we thrived. We became regular attendees at church, going on Wednesdays and Sundays and showing up midweek to help paint and put the church together. And I think it was important because it provided us community. And community is a theme that I've seen run throughout my life, that desire to be part of a community. Well, fast forward a bit. We moved to Long Island, and I called my pastor and I said, I can't find a non-denominational congregation close by to where we are at. So I have a Catholic church, that's definitely out, and there's this Lutheran church. And it has a healing service listed on the front board, so maybe that would be okay. And my pastor reminded me that Oral Roberts was an ordained Methodist pastor. And so as such, the denomination didn't necessarily speak to the beliefs. Moved forward a little bit, a couple of years, and we had gotten very much involved in that Lutheran church. It was a great church. Still like to consider the pastor there one of my colleagues and friends. And in that time, then, I decided that I needed to go to seminary. This church was far more accepting of people, but also very much was middle-class, white, suburban church. And so it had been a comfortable fit for us. As we moved to seminary, so that I could get a seminary education and work towards becoming a pastor, because I saw that as the path forward for me. Chose something that was very interesting. I chose a seminary that was in the Midwest, and so very much a comfortable space. It was in Ohio, but also a seminary that would challenge me. I didn't know how much. And a seminary that would start to break open the heart, and as such really start to help me to contemplate my faith in new ways. And as such, start to really move from adopting the faith I had been handed to building a faith of my own. Still very much grounded in the faith I had been given, but now much more closely more closely moving to and toward the faith I had been growing up with. Seminary was an excellent time for me in my life, and it had its challenges. Don't get me wrong, there were some health challenges on my spouse's part and some other challenges to the finances, and trying to raise 3 kids when you don't really have much of an income, but we did it. And by the end of seminary, it was 2005, and I was writing in favor of single-gender marriage. And this was, I think, sort of the first crack, if you will, in the armor that then led to, we'd sort of already been drifting a little further left, if you will, to choose the current parlance. But this was sort of the first real crack in that conservative theology that I had been inculcated to. Move into my first congregation and decided that outreach to the gay and lesbian community was something that we should be doing. And if I look backwards, there were other cracks starting to show. I had a parishioner wish me Happy Mother's Day. There was an event where I wanted to be part of the feminine side, but didn't participate because I definitely didn't want to be part of the masculine side. And I say this because it starts to point to the fact that I had started to build my own faith, and as such, still very much a faith grounded in the Trinity and in Christ as my Savior and all of these things. But much more the God is love, Christ is love, Christ came for all. How do we embrace all? Moved from there up in the rural New York area down to suburban Long Island, just outside of the city, and really got to spend some time. By this point, I'd really come to accept all people in church, the gay, the lesbian community, but also just sort of to say, all are welcome here. Like, everybody's welcome. I don't care whether you're rich or poor or you know had a problem in your past, and maybe you have an addiction issue, but you know what? Whatever. Come, all of you. And as my mom pointed out, I really did create a welcoming atmosphere. One of my parishioners who was going through divorce was willing to stand up and ask for prayer in the middle of service, and we were able to do that for them. The kids were wonderful. Learning about their faith and really having that opportunity to share that faith with them. But understanding that in this space and in this time, there's also some very conservative forces at work, because it's middle-class, white, suburban America. And it's interesting because it was really my first taste of people who weren't historically white moving into that space, but then very much embracing that cultural question. Fast forward a couple of years, and I went to Ecuador. And in Ecuador was really when I first started to question a number of things. Question my marriage, question my gender, question what I believed. And this was helped along by the fact that I was part of a congregation that was not non-denominational, but multi-denominational and embracing of all people. One of my favorite stories is that I had an atheist who came because he liked my sermons. And so really my teaching became much more about how to live life, how to be a good person, than it did about, and yes, I used the framework of Jesus and I used the framework of the Bible to present that. But it was obviously much more about living a good life. And I think that really starts to point towards this, like you can start to see the evolution, right? From conservative, evangelical, non-denominational into somebody who is Christian, very much mainline Christian, but accepting, and then into this space where really the story of Christ is a way to teach ways of being as much as anything else. So it was during this 2 years in Ecuador that I started to question my gender, and I started to question my marriage seriously, but also was in the process of doing a lot of self-work, like just discovering who I was underneath all of the layers of, you ought to be this or you ought to be that, and really going back to a question the therapist many years had asked me before, which was, who are you? In my case, who is Kit? In your case, add your name. Who are, insert your name. And my first answers came around as, my wife says, my children say, my boss says, my parents say. And ultimately, the problem with that is that I needed to come to a place where I could define me for me and say, I am a person of peace. I am a teacher. I am naturally a pastoral figure. I am a mothering sort. So Ecuador was great, but for reasons we ended up having to move back to the U.S., not wanting to leave Latin America, but having to come back to the U.S., we ended up in Miami. And, I looked at this as a multicultural environment, and I think where I live now in South Beach is very much that way. But where I was a pastor was very much, again, this upper middle class, white, suburban neighborhood where people who were not historically white had moved to take on that life. So here I am, I'm starting to question my gender. I'm really having some theological discussion with myself. And I'm pastoring these people who very much want a historic traditional Christian view of that world, or at least historic traditional U.S.-based Christian view of the world, which is an interesting morph of both culture and Christianity. And it's hard to separate out which pieces are Christian and which pieces are cultural, and so I won't try to do that here. Maybe in another video on another day. Needless to say, after a few years there, I decided I needed to come out. I needed to transition my gender. And in the process, enough of them said that doesn't work for us that I ended up needing to part ways from and with that congregation, which left me without a call. So I'd been a pastor of a congregation for 13 years. It was a bit of a defining characteristic of me. I mean, I knew that I was sort of always the pastor to people around me, always the counselor, always the teacher. But all of a sudden, I don't officially have that role, and I have to start in on a journey. And it was shortly after this, I think, that I started to, a couple things came together. One, I finally got to the place where I could move to full-time transition. No longer having a congregation, I decided that I had nothing left to lose, and I needed to go into whatever I did next as myself. And so, literally overnight, went from socially living as male with a bit of transition into living as a female in our culture. A short while later, we had a nasty bout with my then wife's health. COVID came along. All of these, which are things then that force you to reflect on yourself, on your journey, who you are. Had a nasty blow up and break up with what were then very dear friends. And, this, as I say, this sort of all gave me fodder to think, but then not officially leading a congregation started to give me the freedom, the space to think without those bounds. See, I'd gone into denominational ministry thinking, well, this provides bumper bowling, right? So this says, as long as you're between these guideposts, you're in bounds. Well, now the guideposts are gone, and I don't have to worry about being in bounds. And that really gets me into the journey of deconstruction. And I want to talk more about that journey of deconstruction. I'm going to just give you a little bit of it today because I think it's important. But deconstruction is that journey where you start to take all of those things that you were handed, said, here's what you should believe. So, for instance, the narrative that I need to find a spouse, get married, have 2 children, buy a house, buy a car, live a good life, or the narrative that Jesus was the Son of God, and therefore you need to accept that as part of your faith. Just all of these beliefs that we've been handed, you sort of take them down off the shelf one at a time and ask the question, what do I believe? And it's interesting because looking backwards, I can tell you that everything I really believe is consistent with what was underlying in the past, but is not really directly applicable to the church as we know it in today's society. And I want to just encourage people who are starting on that journey of deconstruction. Maybe you've seen the first cracks. Maybe you've started to say, this part of my faith doesn't make sense. To say, follow that. Because I think as you follow those things, you come to learn what you really believe. Right? A good example. We're handed monogamy as this end-all, be-all, and like the way that we're supposed to be. And somewhere along the line, and I'd question this even in the church world because I'd said, look, polyamory is part of the church world, part of the biblical text. But really to say, you know what? I don't know whether I want to be polyamorous. I don't know if I want multiple partners. But I certainly don't have a problem with it. And I'm open to it for myself. And so, some of these things really do take on new, right? To move from saying I need to be or I want to be in a heterosexual long-term relationship to, you know what? The thing that really matters to me is that I'm sapiosexual and I need to be attracted to the person. Or to say that, you know what? The Buddhist concept of the oneness makes tons of sense to me. But it also correlates in my mind many ways to what we consider that conception of God. And to be able to accept those because you now have the ability to think without those outside boundaries. It has been a tremendously empowering move. It has allowed me to come to a faith that I can think through. You come to me with a question that I've not thought through. I know how to think through that question instead of saying, oh, wait a minute, no, I need to go and talk to thus and such person. So, all this to say, I am a person who has moved from this evangelical Pentecostal, non-denominational, hyper-conservative Christianity into a space of freedom, love, and care through deconstruction and, in some ways, reconstruction of my faith. And so wherever you're at in that journey, I want to encourage you to continue to ask the question, continue to be on the journey, continue to participate in those thoughts. If this has resonated with you and you wish to connect with me more, I invite you to look me up on Instagram and Facebook. You'll find me both on Pink Pastor. Look up pinkpastor.com. It's one of my websites. Talks about some of the professional work that I do. But also then to just either leave a comment here or send me an email, pinkpastor365@gmail.com, as I'm working to build a community of people who can do this work together, who can be mutually supportive of each other as we journey through life. So, thank you for your time and your attention, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.